Hello. In our presentation, we will be covering related topics of environmental racism throughout the history and present day Oregon. The topics outline the way misuse of ecology, environmental science, and racist city planning all accentuated the problem of unfairly subjecting minority citizens to unhealthy and oppressive ways of living. We'll begin by providing an example, understanding of the precarious history of Oregon and how Black and Brown citizens fit into that. Then we'll give examples of the way science has been misused to justify the racist environmental action from all over Oregon. We delve into issues taking place in the state's major cities, such as Portland and Eugene, but also get into rural cases. At the end, we'll offer up solutions moving forward. I hope you enjoy this presentation.
Today, our presentation will cover history of Oregon's environmental racism, urban environmental racism in Portland, environmental racism in Eugene, rural example of environmental racism, potential solution moving forward, and ending with a conclusion.
All right, let's start off with the early history of Oregon's environmental racism. Way back when Oregon was just getting started as a state, in 1844, Oregon's provisional government passed the Black Exclusion Bill, which included a section known as the Lash Law. It prohibited any African Americans from entering the state and ordered those already settled there to leave. Anyone who refused would be publicly flogged. In 1850, U.S. Congress passed Oregon Donation Land Act, offering up to 320 acres of free land to white settlers who would cultivate it. This further excluded people of color from finding reason to come to the state. In 1859, when Oregon became a state, it also became the first and only state whose constitution explicitly forbade Black people from living, working, or owning property in Oregon. Even though 75% of Oregon's residents in 1859 opposed slavery, 89% voted to exclude all non-whites from the state. During Oregon's early years, there were more Ku Klux Klan members per capita in Oregon than in any other state. By the 1920s, 1 in 20 Oregonians were a member of the KKK. Of course, Oregon was far from being the only state to systematically exclude Black people, but Oregon institutionalized these racist ideologies more than any other state. Oregon was the only state bold enough to put it down in writing. Basically, Oregon created itself as a white utopia for white people who wanted nothing to do with people of color. Come to the Oregon Territory to find the perfect white utopia you've been dreaming of. Today, we can still see the effects of Oregon's early history of environmental racism. Instead of being banned from the state, people of color are pushed to areas of the state where they disproportionately deal with various environmental hazards.
The polluted section of the Columbia River in North Portland is the most toxic waterway in the city. It wasn't always that way. Longtime residents once described the slough as a nice wavy waterway where fish and birds once dwelt. However, over time, the city made progressively worse and more irresponsible decisions about the waterway, favoring private industry and profit over sustainability. It's no coincidence that the surrounding neighborhoods primarily consist of minority residents. Quote, "The city allowed the slough to become and remain polluted because the communities affected by the slough are primarily communities of color." Similarly, Black residents are more likely than white residents to live near severe pollution because they have been more dependent on polluting industries for jobs, and because racist policies and sentiments have restricted their access to less polluted neighborhoods.
Eugene has one of the worst cases of environmental justice in the country because of the concentration of industrial pollution near schools. Eugene has one of the worst cases of environmental justice in the country because of the concentration of industrial pollution near schools and residential areas in West Eugene. 99% of toxic emissions in the city are located there. Fairfield Elementary in the Bethel School District in West Eugene has an enrollment of 280 students. 35% of them are Latinx. To quote Mackenzie Prisk, the school is surrounded by at least 14 industries within a 2-mile radius and 11 within a 1-mile radius. Serving as a bilingual education center, Fairfield School also has the highest enrollment of Latinx children and the highest self-reported asthma rate for an elementary school. The population of students enrolled in the Bethel School District have an asthma prevalence of 14.3%, which is significantly higher than that of the other 5 districts combined at 8.1%. One of the worst cases in the area involves J.H. Baxter, a facility that treats wood used for things like bridges and telephone poles with creosotes to last longer. The EPA reported releases of 37,000 pounds of air toxins annually, namely ammonia and creosotes. The Lane Regional Air Protection Agency in 2004 logged more than 700 complaints from 100 households near the plant alleging that fumes from the company's chemical applications were making them sick. DEQ also noted arsenic in soil on the property and pentachlorophenol spreading in the aquifer under the neighborhood. These pollutants overlap and accumulate in every resident in the area, causing numerous adverse health effects in every age of resident.
After talking about the history of Oregon's environmental racism, urban environmental racism in Portland, and environmental racism at the University of Oregon, I would then be talking about some example of rural environmental racism. In 1982, tons of cancer-causing PCB garbages were dumped along 240 miles of North Carolina roadways by the electrical transformer manufacturer. When it's time for cleanup, the North Carolina government chose Warren, a tiny town with a large African-American population, as the site for the toxic waste plant. These actions caused a protest that was considered to be one of the earliest examples of the environmental justice movement. It was an awakening move, showing the country that race and class play a part in who has to live near toxic waste. And unfortunately, they are not just corporate practice of the past. Today, huge oil industry corporations are damaging Louisiana's impoverished river village, resulting in the so-called Cancer Alley. Pahokee, Florida, a town with a 56% African-American and a 29% Hispanic population, has had to deal with the sugar industry, which has polluted adjacent Lake Okeechobee, putting drinking water, fish safety, and property values in jeopardy. Africatown, Alabama, has been contained by paper mill. In Truro, South Carolina, Bloomington Industry discharged cancer-causing PCBs. In Uniontown, Alabama, there is poisonous coal ash, and the list goes on and on. According to the Associated Press, 70% of the country's contained waste sites are near low-income housing, and 2 million people live within a mile of one of those 327 Superfund sites vulnerable to climate change-related flooding, the majority of whom live there are low-income and minority communities. Why did the government and companies do this? One of the protesters from the 1982 Warren protest, Amina Miles, gave us the cold truth. I learned why we were targeted. They chose us because we were rural and poor, and they thought we couldn't fight it. They thought we wouldn't understand.
Scientific racism is a part of the foundation of the United States of America and of Oregon. While Oregon was becoming a state, the research from scientists such as Samuel Martin, Paul Broca, Josiah Nott, and Francis Galton perpetuated racist ideologies through studies which they believed demonstrated objective evidence of the hierarchy of races, but which actually proved how strongly inherent bias affects our perceptions of the world. Scientific racism has aided white people to feel justified in banning people of color from Oregon. When society can no longer justify that, Oregon allowed the burdens of environmental hazards to fall upon poor communities of color in both rural and urban settings. Privilege has gone, and still goes, to those supposedly scientifically proven to be higher up in the social hierarchy of races. Even though science today shows that races are a made-up cultural phenomenon instead of biology, the effects of scientific racism continues today. Let's talk about potential solutions moving forward. Becoming aware of Oregon's racist history is vital for moving forward. We must understand how we got here in order to understand the insidious ways that racism has evolved into institutionalized environmental racism. Natural resource management must use environmental justice as a framework for its policies and actions. We need inclusion and invitation to minority groups to voice their concerns and ideas. Let's see more collaboration and follow through. A fundamental restructuring of wealth, opportunity, and resources in Oregon and across the nation is so important. Education about environmental racism, scientific racism, and Oregon's history. We must focus on protection for minority groups who are most at risk for experiencing the negative impacts of climate change, which are just now beginning and likely to worsen. We must generally focus on legislation which reduces pollution, protects our waterways, reduces greenhouse emissions, protects our soils, and protects local ecosystems overall. We must generally focus on legislation that prevents environmental hazards from continuing to being disproportionately dumped upon minority communities. We must clean up areas of pollution, especially those which disproportionately affect people of color. We must require safer working conditions for people working in factories, farms, etc.
Oregon's unique racist history laid the groundwork for atrocious environmental action that predominantly affected and continues to affect Oregon's unique racist history laid the groundwork for atrocious environmental action that predominantly affected and continues to affect Black and Indigenous Americans. Misuse of land, racist policy, and ecological destruction all contribute to the systemic oppression of minorities. Political and public awareness and changing cultural attitudes towards racism and climate change offer slow progress towards prospective future. But dealing with the current issues at hand and those that cause them is most crucial to improving the quality of life for communities affected by environmental justice and racism.